Another category of model of communication is the interactive models. The interactive models are best for explaining impersonal two-way communication processes, meaning the interactive model of communication expands our understanding of the communication process by taking into account that messages flow back and forth from the receiver, whereas the linear model of communication views the communication process as completed when the receiver decodes the sender's message. The interactive model does not, because here we will see the sender and receiver both responsible for encoding and decoding messages. Under interactive models, we have here two models, the Osgood SCHRAMM'S model and White's model. The Osgood SCHRAMM'S model of communication is defined as a circular model that shows that messages go in two directions. The Osgood SCHRAM'S model of communication is a communication theory. It explains how we communicate with one another, mainly through speech, writing, and discourse. So it emphasizes four key principles. The first one, communication is a circular, not linear. So the listener can both receive and send messages. Next, communication is usually equal and reciprocal. Next one, messages require interpretation. So meaning that there is a lot of interpretation involved when receiving a message. And next one, or the last key principle of this model, we have here that all communication requires three steps. We have here the encoding, decoding, and interpreting a message. According to SCHRAM'S communication model, communication is circular and the sender and recipient of the message can be the same person. A message is encrypted and passed on the same person or to a different person. It is up to the recipient to decrypt the message, interpret it, and then encode it again before sending the message to a new recipient. There is no fourth element such as in Berlo's SMCR communication model. So we have here source or the encoder. The source of the message is the sender, the party who sent the message. The source has to be clear when sending the message and has to be able to show why it is important that the recipient reads it. This is why the sender of a message has to make sure that the information he is providing is useful, relevant, and accurate. In order to ensure that the recipient can properly read the message, it has to be encoded. This means it is necessary for the recipient to know the sender. The success of the attempt at communication will depend on the ability to bring across the information in a simple but clear way. The way in which the message is encoded is influenced by cultural aspects, perceptions, knowledge, attitudes, experience, and skills. Recipient or the decoder. The recipient of a message is the person or group to whom the message has been sent. Whether the recipient is able to decode the message depends on a number of factors. For instance, how much does the individual know about the topic of the message? But also, how open are they for a message and do they trust the source? The interpretation of the recipient are influenced by cultural aspects, perceptions, knowledge, attitudes, experience, and skills as well. Decoding a message is a psychological process. After the message has been received, the stimulus is immediately sent to the brain for interpretation. This is where the message is given a meaning, if at all. This processing phase is also called decoding. Communication is successful when the recipient correctly interprets the message from the source. Next is message. In the studies of rhetoric and communication, a message is defined as information. This information is communicated through words or other characters and symbols. A message, either verbal or non-verbal, is the content of the communication process and plays an important role in the SCHRAMMS communication model. A message may contain verbal content such as speech, sign language, emails, messenger, or WhatsApp messages, or phone calls. A message can also consist of non-verbal content such as behavior, gesture, body language, eye contact, physical contact, timing, and even artifacts. As we said a while back, Osgood SCHRAMMS model has 4 principles. The first principle we have here, circular communication. The image shows how the Osgood SCHRAMMS model works. It involves circular communication between 2 people. Each person is both a sender and a receiver. They are therefore able to communicate to one another rather than only in one direction. This circular feature of model is very different from other linear model of the time, like the Shannon-Weaver model or the Laswell model of communication. The second principle of Osgood SCHRAMMS model is that communication involves interpretation. SCHRAMMS was insisted that communication is not simply the passing of a packet of information from a sender to a receiver. Instead, he saw that messages must be interpreted in order to them to be understood. In the process of interpretation, however, a lot of meaning can be lost. We call the loss of misinterpretation of information as semantic noise, caused by semantic barriers. Semantic barriers are specifically the values, belief, and background knowledge that impact how someone sends and how someone receives messages. As two-way communication keeps on going, it is circular pattern. The semantic noise is ideally reduced because the two-way communicators can come to shared meaning and give one another further clarification in what they actually said. Note, some people call semantic noise a weakness to this model. However, this model simply shows that semantic noise is possible, so it is not a weakness. If anything, it is good that the authors have shown us what it is and how it works. The third principle we have here, communication requires encoding, decoding, and interpreting. You can see in the model that each actor in the communication sequence has 3 roles: encoding, decoding, and interpreting. Here's how each step works. Encoding. When we want to send a message, we need to think about how to craft it to get our message across clearly. We need to think of the right words to say and in what order we should send our messages to communicate our ideas to the message receiver. Next, decoding. When we receive a message, we need to decode it. A message may be packed as text, image, advertisement, speech, and many more. When receiving a message, we need to use our reading skills, listening skills, and so forth to decode the message so it makes sense to us. Sometimes, someone may mishear or misread a message, perhaps if it were mumbled or written by someone who is not native speaker, which will interfere with their interpretation. And the last one we have here, interpreting. Now that we understand the medium of communication, we can go about interpreting the message. What does it mean to you? One person may interpret the message in a totally different way to someone else, or they may not understand it the same way as the encoder, meaning they have misinterpreted the text. Once someone has decoded and interpreted a message, they can then go about encoding their own message to send back to the original sender. They would in turn go about decoding and interpreting. So that is the cycle continues. The last principle of Osgood SCHRAMMS model is that it is equal and reciprocal communication. Why? Because both members of the communication have the capacity to encode, decode, and interpret. This model views the two members of conversation as equal participants. This model therefore works very well to understand a face-to-face conversation or text message exchange, for example, where both members of the conversation will have a back and forth discussion. This equal communication model is very different to many others, which see communication as a one-way street where people take the role of either sender or receiver. By contrast, SCHRAMM'S model sees the participants as both sender and receiver of messages. Now, what are the pros and cons of the Osgood SCHRAMM'S model? Here are the benefits or strengths in the Osgood SCHRAMM'S model. Number 1, shows how feedback can work. This model works well for explaining cyclical feedback. Other models see communication as being a one-way street which fail to account for feedback and dialogue. In this model, the speaker can get feedback about their language, jokes, choice of words, and many more. So they can try to communicate more and more clearly as the cycle continues. Next, recognizes the communication is complex. By accounting for encoding, decoding, and interpretation, this model shows how sometimes we can mishear and misinterpret information. And the last one, sees us as active communicators. While other models see people receiving information as passive recipients, this one shows how we are active in interpreting information we receive. Next, the disadvantages, weaknesses in the Osgood SCHRAMM'S model. It doesn't recognize the communication can be unequal. There are many circumstances where communication may involve one authority figure talking and one or many listeners trying to interpret the message. In such instances, communication is much less equal than in SCHRAMM'S model. Therefore, this model doesn't tend to work in situations where power balances exist. In fact, this model does a poor job overall of understanding how power functions in communication. Next, doesn't work for a mass communication. This is another time communication is unequal. One person communicating to many looks very different to the circular one-to-one model proposed in the Osgood SCHRAMM'S approach For a more appropriate approach for mass media, try the Laswell model of communication. If you have any question about this topic, please comment your name. We will address all your questions during our synchronous classes. If none, kindly click the thumbs up. Thank you.